Thank you very much, Maurice. Rau rangatira mā tēnā koutou katoa. Tuataki me mihi ki te runga rawa nana nei nā mea katoa. Tuarua me mihi ki te iwi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure. Thank you to the NZMSA and to ASMS. This is a fantastic forum, and my discipline, note to self, don't talk too long so that we have plenty of time for discussion. I have presented myself with a ridiculous sort of menu of things to touch on. I'm just going to pick some highlights out of this. But basically, I think if we're going to talk about the role of medical education in preparing specialists for the future, we have to understand where that comes from, what the traditions are. We can't move forward with any confidence unless we know our whakapapa. So I'll talk a little bit about the past. Then I'm going to talk about the present and what's happening particularly in Australasia. And there are some big and not so slow moving factors there which will have a major influence on the future. And then I'm going to speculate a little bit about the future. But the take-home message there is, I think, there's a lot of instability in the systems within which we work at all levels. And predicting the future is actually going to be incredibly difficult. And that is an important take-home message because we have to prepare for an unpredictable future. So let's commence. And I will take my watch off. And I'll give myself 30 minutes, and that will leave us time for discussion. And I've asked Curtis and Maurice to kick me or throw something at me if I'm talking too long. So I want to start with the tradition of the university as an institution in Western societies, because that's currently, in our current model, at the heart of what we do. We teach medicine as a professional program within a university setting, and that comes with a whole lot of implications. Then I'm going to talk about the hospital as a focus, as a focal point for medical education. That, I believe, is changing and will continue to change. And then I want to just mention that seminal 1910 report over 100 years ago, the Flexner report. So in modern democracies, one of the most enduring institutions is the university, the modern university, which has an ancient tradition. The first European universities formed in the late 1100s in Europe, and they too built on a tradition out of the Middle East, the Arabic tradition, and also ancient European cultures, Greece and so on. So this is an enduring institutional form, and it's a big and a messy one. And it's hard to pin universities down. Who owns them, for example? In New Zealand, who owns the universities? They're non-owned institutions. In the New Zealand Education Act, the duty and the responsibility to be the critic and conscience of society is specified in those terms. So they have this very important role in our form of democracy. Along with the Fourth Estate, the media, and other institutions in society, they're one of the safeguards against perturbations in our form of democracy. Now, in terms of medical education, the first recorded public degree in medicine, following an examination, was awarded in 1268 in Bologna. The course length was between 5 and 6 years. So we're a conservative institution. And I mean that both in a joking sense, but in reality. There's a lot of institutional inertia built into medical education. And that inertia is influenced strongly by the various regulatory bodies and other stakeholders who have an interest in what medical educators do. So I just want to highlight the fact that I've said that universities belong in that space where we're critic and conscious of society. It's an edgy space. Now you can critique universities maybe not fulfilling that mission fully enough, but nevertheless that is the space, and it's a very, very important one. However, in medical education, I think we occupy a more ambiguous space. because I think of ourselves as being somewhere between the traditional form of the university and a government department in respect of health professional programs, because of the regulatory and other forces which are brought to bear on us. So it is an ambiguous space. So while we claim to be fully in control of and governing curriculum content, even that is stretching the truth because of the very assertive role that the Australian Medical Council plays on behalf of the Medical Council of New Zealand in regulating and accrediting Australasian universities. So we're in that space between being regulated and being with the critic and conscience of society, as it were. So we're somewhere along that spectrum in terms of medical education. Now, just in terms of thinking about the past, I just want to note, and I'll come back to this in a few moments, the role of the hospital in medical education. This is a picture of Vienna's hospital in 1784. And you'll notice some familiar thematic points here. It's very large, it's very ugly, it's very imposing, it's intimidating. It could if I had put prison above that, you probably wouldn't have challenged me on that. And so on. And 1784 is pre-germ theory, remember. Interestingly, the institution of medicine had very little to offer which was beneficial. It had something to offer, but not a great deal. So the institutional forces which were leading to the construction of this sort of building, and indeed the one we're in, and the bringing together of sick people to be ministered to, were very, very strong. So there's a cultural tradition there which places the focus on the institution as a place for learning. And the reason that it's the place for learning is because that's where sick people congregated. Hold that thought, I'll come back to it. And so much of what we do, our rituals, both in the learning environment and also in the hospital environment more broadly, have a traditional foundation. And here's Charcot in the late 1800s doing direct auscultation on someone's back. Who can recall when the stethoscope was invented? It was the early 1800s. So I don't know why he was using direct auscultation, but he was. Something like 80 years after the invention of the stethoscope. But so much of what you see there is familiar, isn't it? Even though we're separated by centuries. Finally, in looking at the past, I just want to mention one other key element which, as with the other two that I've mentioned, the role of the university and the hospital, has hugely influenced the experience we all have had of medical education. And that was the Flexner report in 1910. Abraham Flexner was an educationalist, not a medical person, and he was commissioned by authorities in the US to look at the past state of medical education in North America and make recommendations to government about how to improve the dreadful state of medical education. And he wrote an incredibly influential report, and I'm just going to give you some of the highlights because they're so important to us now. Flexner argued, as an educationalist, that medical practitioners should be scientists. Science should underpin the patient workup. Investigation and practice were one in spirit, method and object. So he linked science, research and medical care inextricably together. Now, if you ask in the year 2016, the Australian Medical Council, who credits us and all the other programs, do we still believe that? Absolutely, fundamentally, yes. And interestingly, with the profusion of medical schools occurring in Australia in particular, research is particularly weak in some of them. So that link between research and that research-informed environment has partially been broken as those early schools may mature towards being research-rich environments. Something else to hold in the mind. Also from Flexner, faculty members should engage in research because only research will keep the teachers in condition. So if you teach, keep that one in mind. And medical schools must control hospital beds for purposes of clinical instruction. The student can never be part of the organisation in a hospital in which he, note the gendered term, is present on sufferance. That resonates very strongly today too. At the University of Otago, our medical school relates very strongly to about 9 DHBs and less strongly to many more. And the system has a level of integration where education can be conducted within the DHB environment. But I note that DHBs do not have assertive terms of reference which require them to be responsible for future workforce development. And there are no KPIs for DHB CEOs or boards around workforce development or training. So I wouldn't say that we are there on sufferance, but I would say that we are dependent on a functional integrated system working on the basis of long practice and goodwill. All right, I'm moving on to the present now, so there's a little bit of historical context. I want to talk a little bit about the changing international context for medical education, and then some changes taking place in universities, certainly New Zealand universities, and some changes which are occurring in the student body, and then I'll highlight some changes occurring in medical curricula in ours and also elsewhere. So here are some observations, I think facts, and we can discuss these if you disagree with them. Very, very high level of career mobility. I think you know that, but it's a fact, isn't it? Doctors move around the world very, very easily. So that's a strength of a medical degree. But at a systems level, it's a very challenging two-edged sword. Because while our system is, and has been for a long time, dependent on overseas trained doctors, we're also vulnerable to losing our graduates if they go overseas and stay overseas. Here's a fact. This fact is true certainly at an international level and certainly at a national level. Doctor distribution is not consistent with the need for healthcare. And I'll just digress. Australia's tried to fix that problem by increasing the supply of medical students. And I'll come to the numbers related to that in a moment. But they've gone from having around 9 medical schools to 19, with number 20 on the starting blocks now, and another 2 waiting in the pipeline. And they're not fixing their distributional problem. There is increased subspecialisation, and this is a theme which came through with what Andrew was saying. So we all say, Andrew said it, Des says it, I say it, everybody says it, Stephen says it, we need more generalists. Heading in that direction, more generalists. What we actually do through our system is go in the opposite direction. We produce more subspecialists. That's an international phenomenon. That's a tricky one. We need to keep that one in mind. And along with the distributional problem, there are challenges for rural, however that may be defined, and provincial health services in all the countries I've ever looked at, including very much New Zealand. And the best definition of rural that I've ever heard was yesterday, actually. Rural is in the mind of the beholder. It's a good definition because we use the language around rural very differently from, for example, our Australian colleagues and our Canadian colleagues. Yet, in the end, we're actually talking about similar sorts of phenomena. All right. This is a slide showing doctor density per thousand of population for a few OECD countries. New Zealand is the mauve-coloured, purpley-coloured triangles towards the right-hand side, a short data series. Australia's at the top, and the green dots at the bottom are Singapore. Now, this is not the whole OECD, it would be a too cluttered graph, but it's just to point out, particularly if we look over the Tasman at what's happening there in terms of doctor density. Australia has a high density of doctors. It's actually somewhat above the OECD average. It's not a particular outlier, but it's got a much higher density of doctors than New Zealand. And then if we look at medical graduate rates per 100,000 of population, and again look over the Tasman, this data series runs out in around 2011, but just look at the top data series. That is Australia. They're pumping them out. I'll give you the numbers in a moment. They really are. They're pushing towards, I think, 3,700 or 800 graduates per year. And New Zealand, again, are the triangles there in the middle. And you'll see that the United States and Canada are on there, and the UK for comparison. So it's not New Zealand I'm highlighting on this graph, it's Australia. They are, whoops, there we go, that's the rest of Australia projected forward. Australia's attempting to fix its distributional problem through supply. Now don't bother reading that, I'm just going to pluck out a couple of points to make you aware of. I've said there's 21 medical schools in Australasia, Australia and New Zealand, 2 in New Zealand, and currently 19, with Curtin about to start 20 in Australia. Macquarie and one other are lining up. And the politics in Australia seem to prevent them. Well, there seems to be an inevitability. If a university puts its hands up for a medical school and is persistent and patient, it will eventually get one. Because of the Commonwealth state politics. So we can anticipate that Australia will increase its output of medical graduates. There has also been an increase in New Zealand over the last 10 years. For this year, Otago took in 282 domestics. If we have the planned final increase that has been promised by government, that will take us up to, at Otago, 290 domestics. And we'll fill the gap between 290 and 300 with a few international students and the inevitable few repeat students. We're capping our medical program at 300 currently. Auckland is doing the same. So we're pushing towards having 2 medical schools in New Zealand at around 300 students. 300 is quite a big medical school by international standards. So by the year 2020, we'll be looking at a stabilised output of around 550 domestic graduates per year, and very few internationals. I'll come back to the Indigenous students' comments in a moment. Just to highlight that point again, despite this increased output, we still have this problem of maldistribution. That's a big, hairy policy problem, and it's not being cracked. We are working on it as a system, and some measures are being very successful, others less so. And just the final point there is that in the past it's been a rite of passage, if graduates so wanted, to move across the Tasman and get PGY1 or PGY2 jobs. Well, I think we might see, it hasn't happened quite yet, but I think we're on the threshold of this happening, quite the reverse happening. Their graduates will be looking for jobs in New Zealand in the future. And one further point to add to that, apocryphally, and there's no good data on this as so far as I know, there are around 500 New Zealand citizens, and I know some of these individuals, studying medicine in Australia. We don't know what their futures look like. We don't know what their aspirations are. I would assume most of them would like to come back to New Zealand. But if we look at the matching process for PGY1 jobs, only New Zealand graduates, domestic graduates, are getting jobs at the moment. So there aren't, at this point in time, jobs in our system for the New Zealand citizens who are graduating from Australian universities. That situation could, of course, change. So, for the 2015 figures, their medical student, commencing student numbers have plateaued at 3,777, so in 4 or 5 years that'll be the output. That's domestic and internationals together. Last year they graduated 3,649. 3,128 of whom were domestics and the rest international. At the moment, Australia is assuring all graduates of jobs, international and domestic. New Zealand's not been able to achieve that. And looking forward into the very near future, we'll see that the number of graduates from Australian schools, based on the current number of medical schools, it will stabilise around 3,700, 3,800. But as I said, we've got 2 more medical schools, well, want to be medical schools, lined up. In New Zealand, this shows the increase in domestic medical student intake into our 2 medical schools. The top green line is the total for Otago and Auckland, and you'll see that Otago and Auckland are converging. We're becoming very similar in terms of size. In the past, Otago has always been somewhat bigger than Auckland, but that won't be the case. Well, it's not the case as of now, really. I've made that point, so I'll skip over that. All right, so that's about changing international context with a focus on Australia, but of course the rest of the world matters a great deal too. Changing universities. Well, Otago has 9 health professional programs, medicine being one of those 9, and all of those health professional programs rely on very close working relationship with the health system. All our students train for some part of their training within the health system. It doesn't matter if you're training to be a dentist, a dental hygienist, a medical laboratory scientist, whatever it is, you will interact with the health system through your training. So we are completely dependent as a country on a functional system which allows that to happen comfortably. So stress happening in hospitals and in primary care and in communities can have an impact on training. Universities are not exempt from pressures either. Internationally, there are massive changes occurring in universities. Notwithstanding the institutional stability of the form of the university, changes are occurring. No more so than in North America. Very marked changes. And underpinning those changes are important philosophical questions about the role of universities in society. And I just will throw out there as a counterfactual, one could conceive of a medical program being run probably quite successfully from within a polytech setting as a vocational program if one abandons the principles of Flexner. And with the pressures and changes occurring within universities internationally, I think we see a little bit of that happening within a university context, but the weakening of the research base of that training. And in Australia, there is a diversity now of medical schools, and some of them are very strong on the research underpinnings, and some of them are much weaker. Some of them are very strong on rural, provincial, and social accountability, which I'll get to in a moment. Some of them are weaker. Social accountability. So here's an international movement, which is 10, 20 years old. And certainly it's something that we are very committed to at the University of Otago, and so is Auckland. Social accountability for health professional schools refers to the obligation to direct our education and research activities towards addressing the priority needs and concerns of the community, region, or nation, and being mandated to do so. So that means receiving a clear mandate. Now that might sound to you like a statement of the obvious, but it has not been the traditional practice, where medical schools in particular have been aloof from the priority health needs often of their communities, the communities which they serve. So we take that very, very seriously, and we're doing a lot of work on that. And one of the products of that commitment is our admissions guiding statement. So a very big chunk of social accountability can be addressed through the cohorts we bring into our health professional programs, including medicine. So our selection guiding statement is called Mirror on Society, and we say that ideally the makeup of health professional classes should be equivalent to holding a mirror to society In order to achieve this aim, we aim to attract, student and support the most academically able students from a wide variety of backgrounds. And this includes gender, ethnic, socioeconomic and geographic considerations. So we want our graduating cohorts from all our 9 health professional programs to look more or less like the communities they'll be serving overall. Now, I shot back to Andrew the figure of 61% female before. That's for the 2016 medical intake. Over the last 10 years, it's floated more, around 56%, with a little bit of fluctuation around that. So the question is, and I very much value your views when we get to discussion time, at what point do we trigger a policy response to the feminisation of medicine? I mean, it seems to me 61% is getting up there a bit. But if we look just over our shoulder, we see a misogynistic and entirely male-dominated profession. I mean, what an incredible turn on a dime that's been. So I'd value your views on that, because I, at the moment, am struggling with whether or not we should have affirmative entry pathways for males. I'm going to be very quick as I rattle through this. I won't pause there, but just to state the obvious, the representation of Maori in the workforce, the medical workforce, and all other health professions is very, very poor, very low, nowhere near representative. So we have put a lot of effort into increasing Maori students into our health professional programs, including medicine, and this year we have achieved representative proportions of Maori and Pacific students coming into medicine. 17% Maori, that's around, 45 Maori, commencing Maori students this year into second year medicine, and 7% Pacific students coming into medicine. So we have achieved representative proportions, and we will continue to do so, I hope. Socioeconomic is quite different question, and medical schools all around the world have struggled with this and really have only had partial success in cracking socioeconomic as a factor in selection policies. So the horizontal axis on these graphs is the NZMSA index of socioeconomic deprivation, with 1 being the 10% of areas which are least socioeconomically deprived, and 10 being the 10% of areas which are the most socioeconomically deprived. And if you if you put the whole New Zealand population on that graph, all the bars are roughly the same height. So if we look at our intake in 2010, I know this is slightly out of date, but this picture won't have changed very much. For dentistry, you'll see a very clear socioeconomic gradient of students being selected into dentistry based on their area of residence according to their home address at the time of application. And medicine's the same. Now, the question is, how do we rectify this situation and get a more even socioeconomic spread amongst our students into health professional programs? Interestingly, if we slice and dice this a bit more and we look at the profile, the socioeconomic profile of our Māori students, it's actually quite different. It's a much more even spread of students across all socioeconomic groups, and even more so for Pacific. So part of the leavening of the socioeconomic mix in our health professional programs has occurred through attracting in and supporting more Māori students and more Pacific students. Interestingly, and I wouldn't necessarily have predicted this, Asian students in 2010 at least also had a fairly even spread from a socioeconomic point of view. That's the European other picture. So if you wanted to be a cynic, you'd say there's a rite of passage issue here. And that's what we in medical schools struggle with. So we have a complex matrix of selection criteria to try and alter the profile of our graduating cohorts, and we are being successful. Andrew touched on the younger ones here. You're different from us. I sneak in as the tail end of a baby boomer. And just to let you know just how completely distorted the baby boomer view of the world is, We value work for the sake of work. So this is a caricature, but there are big elements of truth in it. If I'm working late at night, then that has inherent value as a baby boomer. I don't think that applies to you. Gen Y and subsequent generations are very clear about what we call the work-life balance, or just work and everything outside work, and are motivated by positive ideals and want to be passionate about their work. That's possibly in common with the baby boomers, but I think is more clearly expressed. Tend not to respect authority because authority is authoritative. We will respect authority on the basis of respect. So there's a generational shift there. And there's a whole lot of other characteristics of Gen Y people which we need to take into account when we're thinking about the future. And there's a whole phenomenon of student debt, which I think looms large in many people's minds, but that's fundamentally changed the social contract that we had with health professional students. That's a very old cartoon, actually, and I love using it. It's completely current. It's probably 10 years old. But it behoves us to think about the social contract between society, the funder of the bulk of the cost of health professional education, and also the students going through. What is that contract? What are expectations? Because the advent of student loans fundamentally changed it. Okay, just a few comments on our curricula, which are changing rapidly and in very positive ways. Much greater focus on vertical integration. We tend not to use the terminology of preclinical and clinical. Those things are merging. Sciences are coming up in the curriculum. Clinical contact is coming down in the curriculum. Much greater emphasis on self-directed learning. Much greater emphasis on community-based learning venues. The community is the perfect environment for learning much of the content of the medical curriculum. And that is because, whereas once you had those big ugly buildings containing all the sick people, that is not the case. Most sick people are out there now, and so medical education has to follow. Nearly all chronic disease management happens out there. Very, very important for the future of medical education. So there's a trend. Along with the population drivers, the demographic drivers of that trend, is the driver of changing morbidity characteristics of secondary and tertiary hospital admissions. Tend to be shorter stay, tend to be much more complex, tend to be multi-morbidity, much less suitable for learning basic medical skills. Interprofessional learning is very, very important. E-learning's upon us and is fantastic, and we're sort of riding a wave, and so in a generation things will be quite different just on account of the e-learning technologies that we can take advantage of. Simulation is very important. Much more emphasis now on quality management, much more emphasis on assessment benchmarking across a wide range of medical schools. So I'm going to finish off by making 2 or 3 comments about the future, and I just want to repeat my take-home message. I think there's a lot of instability when we look at the future, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that there will be threshold effects and disruptive changes and unanticipated changes which make predicting the future not just a responsibility but also an impossibility, and we have to reconcile that. We have to be prepared for our best guess at the future, but be prepared for the fact that that best guess is likely to be wrong in some very important respects, and we need to have a system that can adapt fairly rapidly as and when the changes occur. And I think, as an example of that, if you travel down the west coast of the South Island, or if you travel to Timaru, you will find comprehensive primary healthcare being offered by nurse practitioners, and the punter doesn't know or notice probably. Now, how much more of that will happen before the system starts taking note? Because at the moment it's happening per force, through need. People step in to fill the gaps. All right, I'm not going to talk about demographics because Andrew referred to the ageing population. That's basically the point. This is a lovely concept. It's reasonably old, and I just want to have you lodged in the back of your mind the idea of the ecology of medical care. Now, this was a snapshot, a point in time, which is itself a repeat of a much earlier study, but this dates back to the late 1990s, where these data were collected. But what it tells us is that out of 1,000 persons, 800 will report symptoms at any one point in time. 327 will consider seeking medical care. These data were collected in the US context, so the language is US language, but the point is very pertinent here too. 217 will visit a physician's office. 65 will visit a complementary or alternative practitioner, all the way down to the 8 who are hospitalised and 1 in what in the US language is an academic medical centre. Now that's a very good planning tool. How do we want to change that for the future? Because I believe we will want to change it for the future. We've referred to, or at least Andrew referred to, the expectations of our stakeholders. Finally, my last slide, and then we've got a little bit of time. Medical education in the future. And I'm going to throw up some questions, and I've got some others here. I very much value your views. Our fundamental product in all of Australasia, not in the whole world, but in Australia and New Zealand, is a medical graduate who can do anything. Like, we don't predetermine their vocational pathway while they're training. Do we want that to continue to be the case? There's a question. We will need to think very, very carefully about the role of the tertiary hospital in both undergraduate medical training and also in vocational training. I like the language coming out of Australia for vocational training, which talks about an inverted training model, where the vocational training would be based in what they call a rural centre, and Dunedin would qualify, and then would dip into the metropolitan centre for components of their vocational training which they can't do in the rural centre. So their centre of gravity throughout the whole vocational training is the rural centre. That's an inversion on the status quo, where the centre of gravity is the tertiary centre in metropolitan Australia, and they dip into rural. But their relationships form in metropolitan, that's where they buy their first house, etc., etc. That's part of the distributional problem that Australia has. One way of addressing that is the inverted model. So we need to think about the role of the tertiary hospital. Increasing regionalisation of everything. Certainly medical education is being regionalised. And I dare say all the medical students here will have had regional experiences. That trend will only accelerate. Much greater emphasis on community-based care in all its forms. And also increasing integration of care across all the traditional siloed boundaries which get in the way of offering good health care. So I'm going to leave Maurice and Curtis just these questions hanging there. Do we want generalist graduates? What are the issues around that from your point of view? What balance do we want to strike between content-rich medical education, where you learn a whole lot of stuff, versus high-level leadership, management, integrative skills? Because at the moment, well, there is a shifting balance, but it's more towards the content at the moment. We're shifting towards the high-level skills. But that shift should be informed by a very clear idea of what the graduate profile, the desired graduate profile is. We talk a lot about leadership, and if we're going to produce leaders, we need to be conceptually very clear about what that means and how we train for that. And coming back to that issue which bedevils the future of medicine, technical competence at one end of the spectrum versus high-level integrative skills at the other, once people have graduated. I suggest that machines are going to do much of that technical competence stuff. Andrew referred to pharmacists. It's actually not hard to design a machine to do the dispensing role of a high street pharmacist. That's eminently suitable for a robot and probably would produce fewer errors. Now, much of medicine probably looks a bit like that too. Okay, take-home messages. Yes, covered that. Everything's changing. We don't know what the future will look like, but we do have a duty to predict and prepare. And I assert that one thing we do need to achieve through medical education is a broad conception of leadership and how that can contribute to ongoing positive systems development. Kia tau te rangamari e kia tātou katoa. Thank you.